What I did not mention last time was that the first Parliament was convened by King Edward I, and actually he convened it because he needed money, and he felt like if I just arbitrarily raise taxes, the nobles will get upset at me and I'll get a rebellion just like had happened to his grandfather John. So he said if I could get all the nobles together under one roof and show them what the expenses are and convince them that we need the money, maybe they'll approve of it. So he convened a parliament. The word comes from a French word parlor, meaning to speak. And he got his tax, you might say he got his tax measure passed. And that has affected our Constitution because we have in our Constitution that all tax measures must originate in the House of Representatives. That's one thing that's probably wrong with Obamacare. It was a tax that originated in the Senate. And some people say, therefore, it's unconstitutional. But other than that, every tax bill that's ever gone through this country in its history has always originated in the House. We feel like that's where it has to start. And then after it's originated in the House, it goes to the Senate, where the Senate either approves of what the House passed or disapproves. Nor the Senate is not in any way obligated to approve the House's bill. But anyway, it was for purposes of taxation, and if you study second semester world history, you'll find that the French Revolution, the French king needed money and he convened the Estates General, and the Estates General wound up chopping his head off. But that's a different issue. All right. Now, moving from England to France. In France, you had the Merovingian dynasty that I've talked about. The Merovingian dynasty gave way to the Carolingian dynasty. Well, the Carolingian dynasty gave way to the Capetian dynasty. The Capetian dynasty was founded by Hugh Capet, who was a distant relative of the royal line. But when the last Carolingian died, the nobles got together and said, well, Hugh Capet, you're the most qualified. And they figured he would not amount to much. He was not a very assertive man, so they made him king. He did not have a lot of authority. This was the feudal system, and the French kings were very, very weak, at least at first. But Hugh Capet, what was supposed to happen was, they said, when you die, we're going to get together and elect him our own king. We'll elect him whoever we please. However, Hugh Capet had the foresight to have his son crowned while he was still alive. And then that king, before he died, he had his son crowned. Now, there was a biblical precedent for it. In the Bible, David crowned Solomon while David was still alive. So these kings would crown the next king while they were still alive. And they guaranteed then that the dynasty continued. The first 6 Capetian kings did not amount to a whole lot. But the first one of any importance was Philip Augustus. Well, actually, if you look at it in detail, Philip Augustus' grandfather began to assert himself. These kings would create marriage alliances, so between war, purchase, and marriage, they built up their domains. Now, I've already talked about how that King Louis VII, the father of Philip Augustus, King Louis VII married Eleanor of Aquitaine, which more than doubled his domains. The only problem with that, Eleanor divorced him, and the king lost his domains, and when he married again, he had to marry a wife who did not have so many domains. Eleanor was the most powerful, richest woman in France, rich in terms of the amount of land she held. But the other kings were more successful in engaging in key wars, or sometimes outright purchasing land, or marrying the right person, a woman who had a lot of prestige, and increasing their lands that way. And this built up the dynasty until we come to Philip Augustus. Now, I want to digress a little bit. Yeah, I'm still on the subject of Philip Augustus, which is an old saying, really old saying that goes, save a nail, bad or worse, someday it may fill your purse. Now, around my house, I sometimes see a lot of old rusty nails, and sometimes beside you, Do I throw this nail out or do I save it because it's worth anything? And every time I throw a nail out, and I sometimes do, I think of Philip Augustus. The saying started with him, save a nail, bad or worse, someday it may fill your purse. Now there is another saying associated with him. The saying is, because of the nail, the horseshoe was lost. Because of the horseshoe, the prince was lost. In other words, all right, here's the story. Prince Philip, all right, he was the crown prince. In fact, he was the only son of his father. His father had been Louis VII, who had first married Eleanor, and I told you how Eleanor could not bear many male children, so finally married again. And the woman he married bore him Philip Augustus, the only male child he had. Well, Philip went on a hunt one day. Again, only the high up nobility were privileged to do that, and Philip was the crown prince. And as he passed by a small poor farmer, the farmer noticed that the shoe on the prince's horse was loose. And the farmer called out to the prince, hey, Your Excellency, Your Majesty, your horseshoe is loose. And the prince thought, he was young, he was about 16 years old, a bit foolish. Stop for a nail, it's not worth it. So the prince said, keep the nail, my good man. I'm not going to stop for it. You keep it. You might be able to use it to hang up something with someday. Keep it. Well, because the nail had come off the horse's shoe, eventually the whole shoe worked loose. And when the shoe worked loose, the horse was stopped. And Prince Philip found himself lost in the woods. I mean, he had depended on his horse to get back home. Any of you know that horses, you get in deep woods, they can find your way back home. Well, he was depending on a horse, and the horse could not move. So the prince roamed around, leading the horse the best he could. And he became very, very sick, very delirious. And finally, he actually stumbled on the same farmer who had helped him before. The farmer was able to, with the help of a few other nails, get the shoe back on a horse. But it was obvious that the young prince was not able to travel. So the farmer sent word to the government, to the king, hey, I have your son in my house, and he's very, very ill. When the old king received that news, by this time Louis VII was quite up in years, he became extremely worried. He went to the priest, the best, which was what he knew to do, and I said, what must I do? The priest said, make a pilgrimage to the tomb of Thomas Becket in England, which, yeah, I'll do that, I'll do anything. Slowly and gradually, the young prince was nursed back to health. As for the farmer, and as a reward for saving a prince, he was given a title of nobility and 300 years exempt from taxes. In other words, by saving the nail, it filled his purse. All right. Shortly afterward, after Philip recovered, his father had him crowned, as all the kings did. And then maybe, folks, there's a saying, and I've heard this before, when you retire, be careful. Your body might shut down. My father lived 11 days after he retired. Yeah, retired July 31st and died August 11th, 1985. Bear Bryant, big coach Alabama, lived 1 month after he retired. When the king crowned his son, immediately he started having a failure of health. It's like his body was been told, your work is done, now shut down. And in short order, by the time he was 18, Philip found his father dead, and he himself was now king. Well, all the nobility should have come and swore their oath of loyalty to the young prince, but some of them were too unfriendly. Anyway, Philip became the king, and he became one of the best kings France ever had. He greatly strengthened the power of the monarchy. The French crown. That was his big achievement. He set up a system of taxes that was enforced, set up a system of courts that enforced uniform law throughout France. His father and grandfather before him had made war against some of the worst nobility and brought them into line. By the time Philip died, he passed on to his son a much more powerful monarchy than he'd inherited. Now, Philip did go on a crusade, like his father had done, but the crusade was a flop and Philip abandoned it quickly. He went on a crusade with Richard the Lionhearted, but Richard was very upset that Philip just turned around and quit. But nevertheless, the crusading spirit was not getting them anywhere. All right. The next king of any importance, now hey, there are a lot of kings, folk, more than this that we're not talking about, but it's just an overview of survey course. Philip, known as the Fair, or Philip the Handsome, he did a lot to strengthen the power of the monarchy. Now, he was the one who convened the French Estates General, called the French Parliament by some. Unfortunately, though, the Estates General never became very powerful. Instead, the king became more and more powerful. This is in contrast to England. In England, the Parliament became more and more powerful, and the king became weaker and weaker. Until today, you still have a queen, and she is descended from the old kings and queens, but her power is very, very, very limited. In France, today, you have no king anymore. The French chopped a king's head off like the English did, and then wound up calling two of his brothers back in to be king. But eventually the French said, no, we're not going to have a king. They tried to reason with the last member of the royal family who had some right to the throne, and he said, I'm not going to be a figurehead, I'm going to rule like my ancestors did. And they said, all right, you'll get nothing. So the French have no king today. Again, the Estates General never became very powerful, and except during the French Revolution when it chopped the king's head off. But then Napoleon took over and dismissed them, and you never hear from them again. All right. Now, in Spain, moving on from France, now again, folk, we could easily have spent the whole semester talking about medieval France, and we'd have learned there were many, many more kings than what we're naming, but again, we'll go on from France to Spain. Well, actually, your book calls it the Iberian Peninsula because the nation of Spain did not exist at this time. Spain was a geographical term that meant this whole area here, the Iberian Peninsula. Portugal did not exist yet, but the Spanish were spending their time fighting the Muslims. The fight was to go on for something like 700 years, maybe 800, between 700 and 800 years. And the Spanish eventually drove them out. Eventually the Spanish kingdom was destined to split into two, become Spain and Portugal. I mean, these people spoke a slightly different language, and there was a bunch of mountains that separated them also. So Portugal became a separate country. Spain sent an army in to try to conquer Portugal, but the mountains did a lot to destroy Spain's army. It's been said that Spain is a land that decimates armies. Eventually, in the year 1492, the same year Columbus sailed, eventually Spain expelled the last of the Moors, they called them. Moors is another word for Muslim. Some of the kingdoms, don't worry about, were Castile, Navarre, Aragon, and Portugal, 4 big kingdoms. These are the Christian kingdoms. The rest of Spain, the southern half, was under control of the Muslims. Eventually, Spain and Portugal remained separate. Navarre, Aragon, and Castile were united. In the case of Aragon and Castile, they were united when the King of Aragon married the Queen of Castile. The King of Aragon's name was Ferdinand. The Queen of Castile was Isabella. You all know what happened next, I guess. Eventually, Queen Isabella gave Columbus his 3 ships. This story is told in every elementary school book. But when Ferdinand and Isabella married, they had a son, and the son inherited all of Spain except for Portugal, which refused to go along with the program. And by that time, like I said, they had driven the Moors out of Spain. Now, you have a country which was not a country. It was a group, a loose conglomeration of states, little bitty states called the Holy Roman Empire. Some people have said that the Holy Roman Empire was neither holy nor Roman, nor was it an empire. Nevertheless, it had the title. The Holy Roman Empire was the church's attempt to bring back the old Roman Empire. Essentially, the Holy Roman Empire covered what is today Germany, and it consists of territories like Brandenburg, Hanover, Prussia. You might see some of these names. These countries are all independent. Now, eventually, in 1870, Prince Bismarck united them into one state called Germany. But Germany was destined to remain divided until 1870 into numerous little bitty states. There was Bohemia among others. Bohemia, Galicia, several little bitty states in this region that were loosely united under the control of the emperor. Now, about the Holy Roman Empire, in this instance, Europe actually got a king who was not a hereditary monarch. The Holy Roman Emperor would be elected by a group of people called the electors. The electors were the high nobility, and they'd get together and they'd elect him, but they never elected the former emperor's son. They made sure that didn't happen. So when Charles V got to be Holy Roman Emperor, because he was a fairly powerful monarch, when he died, his crown, his title did not go to his son. They just simply wanted to get away from a hereditary monarch, believing it sometimes a wise and capable father would beget an unworthy, incapable son. So they tried to pick the best person of the group. And you might think, hey, this is a great idea. It is, except you have to understand the mindset of the nobility, of the higher ups, the aristocracy. Among the upper classes, you only get to be upper class if you're born into it. Now, in America, Abraham Lincoln was not considered upper class while he was alive, but his sons were, if you follow the logic. In other words, if your father was high up, you had to be born in it. Also, among the kings, if you were the oldest son of your father, and you got to be king, you got more respect than you were if the oldest son died and the throne went to the second son. It was looked on by the other nobility, the other aristocracy as, you're not quite as good as your older brother would have been. You're not quite, because after all, you're not the oldest. They just simply respected the son of a king more. So the idea of an elected monarchy, another nation had tried it, Poland had an elected monarchy. They'd elect a king, he'd serve for life. When he died, they'd elect someone who was not his son. The problem is Poland wound up being partitioned and split between three countries, Germany on the one, Prussia on the one hand, Russia on the other, and Austria. Why? The aristocracy of Europe did not respect a king whose father had not been king. I mean, do you understand the logic? I mean, well, maybe you don't understand the logic, but this is the way that the aristocracy's mind works. You only get to be aristocracy if you were born into it. If you usurped it, your sons might be respected, but you'd never be quite up to the level of the highest aristocracy.